dear Margie, professors, lecturers, students, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Thank you very much for the invitation to come to Yola, to come to the university. I have been very much looking forward to this day and to spend a couple of days here. And now I am very, very glad that I came. I will bring with me when I go back to Abuja and when I go back to Sweden next week, because I will give a lecture or a presentation about Nigeria at a Swedish university next Tuesday, so it's 1 week from now. I have many images and good memories, interesting memories and food for thoughts from Yola, and I will share with this university, Lund University in the south of Sweden, next Tuesday. Actually, Monday, Wednesday, and Tuesday, but my lecture is on Tuesday. First, before I start with the topic itself, I would give some figures, some remarks about Sweden itself. Sweden is not a very, very well-known country, and I will take the opportunity to move to this, whatever it's called in English. So, Sweden is roughly half the size of Nigeria. It's roughly 450,000 square kilometers. Nigeria has, I think, 980 or something, so it's roughly half. Our population is, however, much smaller than that, also percentage-wise. It's 9.8 million. We are a constitutional monarchy. It means that parliament, constitution rules. We have a king as a head of state. We have had a monarchy for more than 1,000 years. It's a well-established, rather popular, very popular institution. The king has no power at all. He cannot even vote. And nobody can vote for him either, by the way. So he has been on the throne since 1973. His oldest child is a girl, so we will have Queen of Sweden after in the succession of this king. And funnily, strangely, or amusingly enough, the Crown Princess' first child is also a daughter, so we will have 2 queens in a row in the coming decades, maybe in the next century. Sweden is mainly a Protestant country. We used to have a state church. This is a rather strange species, state church, which meant that you were born into the church until only a decade ago. Although we were a state church, it's a rather secular country. Catholics were traditionally not very many, there were not many Catholics in Sweden at all. We broke with the Pope in 1527 and did not restore diplomatic relations until 1983, when we established embassy in the Vatican. It's also, it gives a lot of the Swedish history in between here. We were very reserved when it came to the Catholic Church. Now it's different, but for so many hundred years it was the case. Sweden being located where we are, I mean in the northwestern part of Europe, we did not have many Swedes who are Muslims. There was a census in 1930 to see what religion did people have. Of course, 99.99% or something were Protestants. not 15%, but 15 individuals in 1930 were Muslims. And now it's very different. Sweden was known to be a homogeneous country, ethnically, language-wise, and so on. Now, in the age of globalization, it's very, very different. We don't know we don't count how many belong to this or that religion, but it's estimated that the number of Muslims right now is 500,000, from 15 individuals to 500,000, most of whom, the very large majority of whom are, of course, immigrants. This number is expected to rise significantly due to the migration flows which are now taking place from the Middle East to Europe, mainly to Germany and Sweden. We expect, by the way, to have 130,000 more people due to immigration from the Middle East in the next coming year and the year after, another 120,000. So these are some basic facts. Our government, the present government, consists, we have 8 parties in the parliament. 8 parties, political parties. The government consists now of Social Democratic Party, the Prime Minister, and the Green Party, supported in parliament by the so-called leftist party. Now, when I say leftist, it means it's translated into English, leftist. We have our own language, of course, but translated to English, it would be the leftist party. They have almost a majority. They don't have a full majority. The government is jumping and hoping for support from the opposition. There are 4 opposition parties, of the 4 old traditional opposition parties, and then we have, like many other countries in Europe, a rather new, rather, I would say, populist party, which came into parliament in 2010, so a rather new one. Actually, nobody of these other parties, the 7, 4 plus 3, want to have any cooperation with a populist party, which has its roots in very obscure, how shall I say, thoughts and ideology. So this party, it's called Sweden Democrats. I should not spend many words on it, but Sweden Democrats. Okay, so 7 parties decide together what the outcome in parliament will be. Okay. It was mentioned, Rwanda was mentioned. In the Swedish parliament, 56% of the MPs are men. So 44% are women. Men, women. This is how it is. In government, however, we have 24 ministers, 50-50, 12 plus 12. Men, women. The Prime Minister is a man, the Foreign Minister is a woman. The most powerful minister in the government is a woman, it's the Minister of Finance. Well, apart from the Prime Minister, of course, but the Minister of Finance is a woman, and it should be noted. Okay, this I think I will now soon go back to there. I have given some basic data anyway about Sweden. Before I will continue my introduction a little bit by giving some years, some moments in Swedish history, with which I want to show that this thing with equality and gender aspects and so on in Europe, in our history, was a very long process. every process which shall be sustainable has a long history, but I want to give some indications about the Swedish road, the Swedish path to feminist foreign policy and to have a government which is a feminist government. In 1842, I will not write it down here, but in 1842 we had a law prescribing the primary education is compulsory, 1842. In 1853, women were allowed to become primary school teachers. In 1870, women were allowed to study medicine. In 1873, women were allowed to take an academic degree, except in two subjects, namely law and theology. In 1883, the first woman PhD appeared. She was a PhD in history. In 1921, women could vote and be elected to parliament. In 1921, it's not that long ago. In 1922, we had the first woman MPs. In 1947, the first woman minister in government. It's not long ago. In 1959, the first woman priest or pastor. In 1976, the first woman foreign minister. In 1985, the first woman party chairman, 30 years ago only. In 1997, the first woman bishop. In last year, 2014, the first woman archbishop. So these are some points I would like to make. The evolution or the development when it comes to women participation in history took, in our case, a rather long time. Nothing is, of course, said in an enlightened world with the democracies all over the place that it should take as long time at all. And we have Nigeria as a very good example. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sweden has now a government, a feminist government since 2014, feminist government. The government puts gender equality in focus, both in its national and international work. It is the world's first feminist government. The Prime Minister has said, my government is a feminist government, and I will try to explain what he means and what it means. The policy has an overall goal to let women and men have the same opportunities to shape society, as well as their own private individual lives. Basically, what it is all about is democracy and justice. At the same time, gender equality is a part of the solution to create jobs and economic growth. It's a contribution to economic development, since both men and women will have their rights observed through feminist policies. Feminist policies is not directed towards men, it's for society, for women I mean, it's for society. The policy of gender equality, the policy of a feminist government's policies aims at giving conditions for boys and girls, women and men to develop without obstacles, prejudices and stereotypes. I would like to emphasize the role of identities and structural orders influence life conditions for different groups of men and women. Prior to all decision-making in government, the Swedish government, the feminist government, makes an equality analysis very early on in the decision-making process, so that the equality perspective is integrated from the beginning as a natural part of the problem solution. This integration does not only contribute to gender equality, but it also leads to more efficiency and efficient policies and effectiveness. In short, the society will be better run with feminist policies. One of many examples of inequality in Sweden and in other countries is the fact that women often take larger responsibilities for care of relatives and children. Many women reduce their paid workload in order to, free of charge, take care of family. They thus pay a high price for their traditional responsibilities, since they get lower income. The family as such, the family as an entity, gets lower income, and eventually the woman or the women get lower pension. During this autumn, 2015, my government, the Swedish Government Office, initiated a development process to secure the equality perspective in decision-making. The Minister of Equality, it's a lady, has set together a special group within the government to develop equality policy making, and all ministers and state secretaries, vice ministers, have to take part. It's their obligation and duty to take part in these courses. And since they do, the civil servant as an entity, as a group, all take part. I am taking part in this kind of courses. Mainly, so far, women have worked with equality work. However, in recent years, men and boys take more part in this work. This is an important part of the government's strategy. For instance, through the UN campaign, He for She. I think it's familiar to many of you, but He for She means a lot. It's a very important part of when the government makes policies, both at home and abroad, in a foreign context. So, I have now given some facts on the board here. I have given some domestic policy remarks, and I will now speak a little bit about, or present a little bit about the Swedish feminist foreign policy. What does it mean? What is it all about? When it's only 1 year ago, it was presented, many questions were raised on, in the newspapers' editorial pages, and political commentators, some of them ridiculed it, some of them thought, what is now, what is this, what is it all about, and why do we have to listen to this? This was some of the remarks, actually. Now, I dare say, 1 year on, it's talked about with respect. It's realized that this thing with feminist foreign policy, the Prime Minister declaring himself as a leader of a feminist government, has created a lot of curiosity and a wish to know more about it. And this is a driving force when policy is shaped. So, its goal is to combat and fight discrimination against women internationally, to create conditions for women better and contribute to peace and development. And ladies and gentlemen, this is not at all, we don't claim, the government does not, Swedish government doesn't claim this is rocket science in any way, not at all. It is in fact quite simple things, and it's all embedded in resolution 1325. So which deals with peace and security and women. As I interpret it, the resolution, the UN Security Resolution 1325, has laid the path for this, the Swedish feminist foreign policy and the Swedish feminist government. The goal is that women's participation in decision-making shall be reinforced, both in countries who enjoy peace and in countries in conflict, and in countries where reconstruction post-conflict is conducted. Thereby, sustainability of the country's development is strengthened and secured. Concrete steps for women's rights will be taken through more cooperation with civil society, cooperation from our government side, as well as with our partners in the European Union and the United Nations, as well with our Nordic European Union colleagues, namely Denmark and Finland. The Swedish government in this context has proposed a special European Union representative for equality and for the UN Resolution 1325, which will celebrate its 15th anniversary this year. The government will continue the work to counter impunity for sexually based violence, which is highly needed both in peace and in, of course, armed conflict. The UN members should work and push for women's and girls' human rights, their right to economic empowerment and their right to decide over their own lives and bodies. This is particularly important when we now celebrate the 20th anniversary of the UN Women's Conference in Beijing, 1995. I was at that time deputy head of mission of Swedish Embassy. I was very much involved in the Swedish delegation preparations for the Women's Conference, UN Women's Conference. And I could see at close range the enthusiasm from the Swedish side when we entered into to start the process which led up to UN Resolution 1325, and in our case to a Swedish feminist foreign policy. The latest report by the UN Secretary General rapporteur on sexual violence in conflicts shows that the situation is still very serious, and that sexual violence is used as a tool or method even to force people to flee or to subjugation. Especially ethnic and religious minorities are targeted. In the report, it is said that sexual violence is an integrated part of the extremists' strategy. Therefore, it is very important that while combating terrorism, measures against sexual violence must be included. When Mrs. Zeina Bangura, who is the Secretary General's Special Representative of Sexual Violence in Conflict, when she visited Stockholm half a year ago, our government reconfirmed its strong engagement and support to measures against sexual violence in conflict. Sweden is the single most donor to UN action against sexual violence in conflict. We want to continue the work so that the United Nations, in all its activities, in all its programs, in all branches of the United Nations, peacekeeping activities, etc., integrate work against sexual violence. This is a very important part of the feminist foreign policy. One of the results from a meeting which our foreign minister had in New York 2 months ago, or 1.5 months ago, with Foreign Minister John Kerry, was that our Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström, a lady, takes over as chairman for an international action group against gender-based violence. The group's name is Call to Action Against Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies. This is also a very important part of a feminist foreign policy. This initiative is a Swedish-British one, and it is important that we get attention around it worldwide, especially so as we have so many humanitarian crises for the time being. Unfortunately, women and girls encounter serious problems in refugee camps, at border controls, and during dangerous journeys which many refugees are on at this moment. More and more rapes are reported in this context. The chairmanship of this group means that United States actually have prepared an action plan, and we will follow up this action plan and see to it that the member states of the United Nations bring the action plan into their own actions and policies, and thereby women's rights, and women's issues, female issues may be forwarded. In the past, one may have looked, or not only one may have looked, it's a fact actually, that people have looked at sexual violence as something absolutely inevitable in wars and armed conflicts. It was always shameful to speak about them, to recognize them as a weapon, but now this insight seems to gain terrain more and more. Sexual violence in conflicts is an open terror tactics. It's a part of the Swedish feminist foreign policy to make people aware and that we can join forces. Feminist foreign policy should not only be words. The world needs deeds, the world needs action, the world needs more action in this field. Let me point at two areas. And I come back now to Resolution 1325. The effective implementation of this resolution is crucial to achieving sustainable results. We know that early investments in inclusive peace-building processes that empower women lay a stronger foundation for reconciliation, which in turn contributes to reducing the risk of relapse. Together, we need to ensure that the women, peace and security agenda is placed at the center of all discussions and mainstreamed into all aspects and phases of the UN engagement, be it in analysis, research, planning, training, and implementation. So firstly, resolution 1325. Secondly, we must acknowledge that we are acknowledging that the United Nations is far from the only actor in this field. For Sweden, finding ways to improve cooperation between the UN and regional, sub-regional organizations such as the African Union is a priority. This means institutionalizing cooperation, define burden sharing, and ensure predictable financing in a regional organization's capacity to respond to conflicts. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give you one very concrete example of how Swedish feminist foreign policy is made and may work in real life and real time. This example will illustrate very well the idea behind the feminist foreign policy. Again, it is not at all rocket science. We have not invented anything new. We are only adapting our views to the world which, as we see it, the existing world. We have a Swedish government agency called Folke Bernadotte Academy, the FBA. It has been given the assignment by the government to create a network of female mediators. It serves as a part of Sweden's feminist foreign policy. And again, our commitment to the implementation of Security Resolution 1325. The network will be international, but with a Swedish core. So in the coming 2 years, a network of female mediators will be established and cooperation will take place with female mediation networks from the global south. The aim is to increase the number of women in mediation and facilitation and to be able to support peace processes around the globe. The adoption of, again, Resolution 1325 is a global commitment to the inclusion of women. In June, 4 years ago, 2011, the UN General Assembly approved a resolution on peace mediation. It was the first peace mediation resolution. This resolution encourages to strengthen the position of women in conflict resolution efforts. Still, women are underrepresented at the peace table where decisions about the future are made, either as negotiating parties or as mediators. There's a clear underrepresentation. We can no longer say that it was ever a valid argument that there are no competent women in mediation. Women have demanded peace in processes like in Liberia. They have negotiated as parties, as for example in the Philippines and Kenya, and served as mediators and negotiators in places like the Ukraine and Angola. Despite these very successful interventions and work, this research show that during the period of 1992 to 2011, it's 19 years, only 2% of the chief mediators and 9% of negotiators in peace processes were women. In order to shift the numbers, attitudes need to change and more women need to be appointed as mediators or as part of mediation teams. Neither is it an argument to say that the peace needs to be dealt with first and then come women's issues, in quotation marks. Women's perspective need to be included from the onset in order for the peace to be sustainable. Peace can only be had when the entire population and their needs are accounted for. Negotiations have traditionally focused on the warring or political parties, where women are either not a part or gravely underrepresented. Studies show that the participation of women at all levels is key. All need to be represented in a process, both at the table physically, but also in the types of questions discussed and points agreed. If all aspects and if all perspectives are not taken into account, how can we expect peace to last? Ladies and gentlemen, this is rather rhapsodic, but I hope you have enjoyed it anyway. Nevertheless, I have tried to give reasons why a feminist foreign policy is needed and why a feminist government is not such a strange species as it may seem. It may seem when you hear it for the first time. A feminist government, a feminist foreign policy is very much relevant for both men and women and for the world as a whole, in my view and in my government's view. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.